Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the third webinar for the Cisco CyberOPS Intro short course with IT Masters and Charles Sturt University. Today, we're going to be covering access control models. So all of the different ways to control access, whether that's physical infrastructure or networking based. Matt will have all of the information on that. We are joined, of course, by the wonderful Lily Nguyen, who is running everything on the back end and making sure things go smoothly for us, and our wonderful mentor, Matt Constable, who will be taking you through all of the course content. Before we get started, IT Masters would like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Dja Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders and ancestors and acknowledge their ongoing sovereignty over these lands and waters. So welcome everybody to this third episode, if you will, of the Intro to Cisco CyberOPS short course. If you have not yet watched or you missed the previous 2 weeks modules, do not fear. Those will be available to you on the intranet, on the Moodle, at learn.itmasters.edu.au. That's also where you'll be able to find all of the course materials, surveys, which we'll talk about in just a second, exams when those are available, and forums as well for discussion of the topics covered, as well as, relevant similar topics with your fellow students and your mentor. So once again, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions that are directly for Matt about the course content for this course, you can pop those in the Q&A section. If you've got kind of administrative questions in general about this session, you can pop those in the webinar chat. Just navigate to that and drop a message in down the bottom. Select to everyone in your webinar chat if you'd like to have conversations with everybody else that is in the course. But please keep the Q&A section for questions that are directly about the content that we're covering in this course specifically. We'll do our best, as usual, to answer those questions. We may not make it through all of them for a variety of different reasons, but that is, again, very much what those forums at learn.itmasters.edu.au are for. We do have a survey that we would really love for as many people as possible to fill out, just about your experience with this course and how you've engaged with it, the materials and the format and presentation and everything like that. That is available at learn.itmasters.edu.au, and Lily has very helpfully popped the link to that in the chat currently. So you'll be able to access that now or at any time via the short course forums. It'd be really, really great to help us improve the short courses in the way that we run these to get your feedback from those. Just some questions. We've got a few questions around the exam and things like that that come through regularly. The exam will be available online at that learn.itmasters.edu.au once the final module has been completed and uploaded. The results will be available approximately 1 week after the exam is initially uploaded, and that is when your certificates will also be available upon completion of the exam, and getting access about a week after the exam goes up online to the results as well. So hopefully that preemptively answers a couple of questions that people have. Again, if you are struggling with any technical difficulties, or if you have questions about IT Masters courses in general, feel free to email us at shortcourses@itmasters.edu.au, and our wonderful short courses team will be able to take you through any difficulties you might be having or answer any questions. And if you're interested in studying a full-length ITM and CSU course, so whether that's a graduate certificate or a master's, you can check out the eligibility .itmasters.edu.au, which will take you through the eligibility process, and our wonderful admin and eligibility team would love to take you through your options for completing a full-length course. So hopefully that covers all of the housekeeping, etc. for tonight. And without further ado, I will hand you over to Matt Constable. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Jack. Welcome back, everyone, for this third of our series of four webinars on the Cisco Certified CyberOPS certification. So tonight in this module, we're going to be talking about access control models. And after this week, we really will have covered the three main core fundamental models, if you like, of the CyberOPS certification. From this point onwards, if you were to follow all modules of the CyberOPS certification, you would start to delve into some more Cisco specific type topics and use some Cisco specific type tools and implementations. So next week, we're going to talk about attacks and vulnerabilities. So we're starting to get a little bit more practical next week. So this is the last of our fundamental modules. And these three modules together, the idea is to give you those foundation cornerstones, if you like, of knowledge to enable you to then go on with the more technical and practical aspects of this particular certification. So without further ado, let's move on. So just a quick refresh on the CIA model that we're going to be using, and many certifications use the CIA model because it's nice and simple and easy to remember. So CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So this is brushing up from what we've talked about the last couple of weeks. Confidentiality really is just keeping things secret. So you're only disclosing information or giving access to information or resources to people that actually have a valid need and an authorized use for it. Integrity is ensuring that the assets that you have in your capable hands are not modified or changed or deleted in an unauthorized fashion. So yes, you can still change, you can still delete them, you can still add, you can still move, but they have to be in an authorized way. And then availability, the last one of the three key tenets, is just about making sure that people who have the right, the valid authorized right to have access to your assets can gain access to them when they need them at all times. So it's about keeping your systems up and running in a nutshell. So let's have a look at access control fundamentals. Access control is a really broad, far-reaching sort of term that covers all of the different types of controls that we can use to regulate the way in which subjects interact with objects or users interact with our assets or our systems. So a subject is simply defined as any active entity that requests access to a resource, which is also called an object. Now, generally, that would be a user, but it can be another system or another process. It doesn't always have to be just a user. It might be another server interrogating our server. So if we think about network management as a simple example, we might have an SNMP server that is requesting some information from a router or a switch or some other device to determine what status a particular interface is in, for example, whether it's up or down. That SNMP server or that management server then becomes the subject for the purposes of that particular communication. So a subject is typically a user or an entity that wants to access some sort of resource, and that resource is called an object. It's the passive entity, typically a passive entity in the context of this communication, that contains some sort of information or data or something that is requested or required by the subject. The role of the subject or the object, so depending on which is which, is purely dependent on the entity that requests the access. So if it's a server, the server can obviously act as an object or a subject, depending on what its part in the communications is, what part it's playing. Is it requesting or is it sending? Then it could be one or the other. A user can also be one or the other as well. So you might have another user or a server, for example, requesting some information from a user, in which case the object and subject roles would be flipped. a single entity can be considered a subject or an object, as we just said. So, for example, a web application could be considered a subject when a user runs a browser program and requests access to that website. The web application might need to query an internal database to retrieve some information on the user's behalf, in which case the web application then becomes a user or a subject, and the object is the database server that it's querying. Then there might be a stage where there is a web application form that you need to fill out. And in this case, it would be the subject. That form would become a subject, and the object or the repository of information would be you as the user. So you would have to then put that information into that form. So that particular role, or the status of that role, can flip and flop depending on what's going on with the communication at the time. The relationship is generally shown in this way from a security perspective. So in this case, we have a user, Derek, who is the subject. We have this blue box labeled access control, and inside that we have all these policies, processes, mechanisms, procedures, and tools that allow us to grant, prevent, or revoke access, or how much access someone might have within to that particular object that they're trying to access. And then around our object, so it could be a server, could be a database, could be a simple Word file or an Excel spreadsheet, whatever it is, we have around that our security defenses, which provide our three pillar tenets of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So as you can see, hopefully, access control is a really important component of this CIA triad that's protecting our object. There are four main building blocks that categorize our access control methodologies. And we're going to look at four models, if you like, or methods that tonight that they're not the only access control models, but they're the ones that the CyberOPS certification primarily deals with. And so we're going to deal with them as well. But regardless of the actual access control model, the building blocks are the same. So there is firstly the process of identification, which is asking the subject to provide some sort of identification. We then have authentication, which is then interrogating the subject about their identity and what verification mechanism they can use to prove to us that that identity is actually authentic and there's not someone purporting to be someone else. Authorization is the process where all of the policies and the rules that we implement in our access control models begin to be implemented, in so much as this is the time when we allocate particular rights and abilities to the authenticating subjects so that they can access the target objects as they need to perform the objectives of whatever task they're trying to perform. And then lastly, we have accounting. Now, this is the process of keeping logs and keeping tabs on what operations are being performed on our objects by the subjects that have been authenticated. So in other words, what the users are doing to our assets as after they've authenticated and been authorized. And so these are some sort of questions that these particular building blocks answer. So identification, the obvious one is, who are you? Who is it that is trying to access my resource? And we could use things like a user ID or an IP address, for example. The authentication process is, okay, I now know who you're telling me you are, but can you prove that you are in fact who you're telling me you are? And this is where we have our things like our passwords or our proximity badges or other biometrics like our fingerprints and retina scans, voice recognitions, typing patterns, those sorts of things. Authorization, once that's done, once identification or authentication is done, then we can move to authorization, where the access control model will interrogate the policy base that we configure it with to determine what resources or objects this particular user who is now authenticated can access, and what they can actually do to that particular resource. So can they just read? Can they read and write? Can they change things? Can they move it? What can they do with it? So an example, user A can access resource B in read and write mode, would be something that would come up with. And then lastly, there is accounting. So this asks the question of the subject and object, what has been done with that resource by this particular subject? An example might be user A has modified resource B on July the 4th, 2024. Be good if they did, considering that's a date in the future. The process. So to determine the policy that we use in our access control, whoever owns the policy needs to evaluate the asset or data that they're going to put up for access. So what I mean by that is that the owner needs to understand the relevance and importance of each asset within the organization so that they can then apply adequate security controls around that asset to protect it as much as it possibly can. Just a quick question there. The question is, does MFA sit in authentication block? MFA stands for multi-factor authentication. So yes, absolutely, it lives in the authentication block. So once we've done that, once the asset has been identified and evaluated to determine its value within the overall context of the organization, we then have to properly mark it or classify it so that that classification, therefore the importance of that object to the organization, is clear. And then we also need to think about things like disposal policies, which establishes a time period when we say after this time period has elapsed, access is not required to this particular asset anymore. Now, that's not always required. Not all assets will require that. But if assets do require that, then this is the time frame to do it. Once you've identified the value of the asset, its importance to the organization, its classification, it may be when we get to the classification examples or the tables, you'll see why it may be that there'll be a time over which access is redacted. So some terminology. Asset or data classification is simply the process of classifying the data based on the risk for the organization should that particular asset be compromised in some way. So whether that's through it leaking into someone's hands that shouldn't have it, so breaching confidentiality, it may be changed in an unauthorized manner, which is then a breach of integrity, or it gets deleted, for example, in which case it's now an issue of availability. Asset marking is simply the process of labeling an asset with whatever classification it's been based for or it's been identified as. So classification is determining what label should be applied to the asset, and marking is applying that label. The access policy definition is then the processes built around defining the policies and the rules that then determine how each of these objects or assets are then accessed by subjects or users based on the data classification that we've given them. And then finally, that data disposal is the process of then eliminating the access, removing the access, or otherwise disposing of the asset in a timely manner. And so if we look at the types of classification we can use, these are the two main common implemented standards that are often talked about in many different cybersecurity certifications, and certainly in the CyberOPS one. So the military government classification is one we see a lot of in the movies. So going from top secret, secret, confidential, and unclassified. In a commercial sense, however, we don't usually use those sorts of terminologies, but we use confidential, private, sensitive, and public. which basically equate to the same things. So top secret or confidential, we're saying if that particular asset was somehow compromised, it would cause grave danger to the business or grave danger to the organization. And what that means is it's really, really catastrophic. So it might mean end of business, or it could mean, in a military sense, the death of many hundreds, thousands, maybe more of armed servicemen, of civilian population, whatever, as a simple example. Secret and private are the next layer down. So if they're to be compromised, then there's still severe damage. So it might, in a military sense, say, severely disrupt a particular military operation. So it was less effective, or it had to be reorganized or cancelled. In a commercial sense, it may be that it might be severely embarrassing or cost us a little bit of money, but it's not going to terminate the company altogether. It's not going to be highly catastrophic. Then confidential and sensitive means there's some limited damage. So again, it might be, leaking of some sort of information that might be harmful to us if it's turned over to a competitor or an opposition military force, for example. And unclassified as public, we don't care. If it gets leaked outside the organization or someone compromises it, it's not going to cause us any real damage. Now, once these assets are marked with whatever classification they're deemed to fit into, this allows us to determine clearly how we are going to handle the access control around those particular assets or objects. In addition to this classification, it's obviously also important that each asset or object is uniquely identifiable through some sort of name, implementation, deployment, or description. So things like a physical storage address or other appropriate details, names might be useful as well. Combining all this is part of the process of maintaining an up-to-date asset inventory. Okay, so we know what assets we have, what they're called, what they're composed of, where they are physically located, from where they can be logically located, what their classification is, and therefore what the access control restrictions around that particular asset or object is. Now that we've classified and marked our assets, we have to determine or come up with access control policies that are then applied to these particular assets and subjects and are appropriate to their level of classification. Policy must include who can access the asset, when, and in which mode. So who can access the asset, when they can do it. So it might be times of day. You might have some people can access only during working hours, for example. Others may be able to access at all times. And in which mode? So can they change it? Can they read and write, or can they only read? The policy, the underpinning policies, will begin to describe how we're going to protect that asset depending on the state in which it is. And there are 3 states in which our information can be in. The most common is when it's at rest. This is when it's in storage. So most of its lifetime, data will be in storage. And in this example, we typically protect using some form of really strong access control methodology or encryption type services. Data in motion refers to when we're transmitting information between 2 parties. So it's in transit. Now, this is typically electronically, but it may actually be via USB keys, like physical traveling as well. In any case, if we consider that, like carrying around a USB key, yes, it's in transit, so we have to put appropriate physical controls around that. So, for example, for ensuring that it doesn't get stolen while it's in transit. But the data itself is still at rest, isn't it? Because it's on a storage device. And so we would implement strong access controls or encryption in that particular example. In terms of in motion across a digital environment, then if something goes, regardless of where it goes, whether it's inside our organization or outside of our organization, at some time, it's going to cross a perimeter boundary. And when we do that, we have to ensure that it's protected while it's in transit. So again, typically this might be done via end-to-end encryption technologies, VPN technologies, which are usually used in this particular circumstances. Data in use refers to when it's actually being processed by applications or programs or stored in a temporary or volatile memory such as RAM, in a CPU register or something similar. So in this case, we have hardware security modules, which will help us to protect in some circumstances in this area as well. However, we have to be mindful that if a device that we're processing information on is compromised, then that is a major risk. Data at rest and in motion is slightly easier to protect than data while it's in use, being processed. So it becomes very important then to ensure that the host itself or the device that is doing the processing is very much secure and protected. Just harking back to our roles and responsibilities, because we'll see how these relate to access control in a minute. So as we've said before in the previous couple of weeks, cybersecurity is a responsibility of everyone, as is information security. So remembering information security is security within the organization. Cybersecurity also entails all those interactions that we have with outside parties. So it's everyone's responsibility, whether they are users, people walking by, metaphorically speaking, or actual custodians. And we have four main roles, which are custodian, owner, administrator, and user. And these roles are not always mutually exclusive. So you can be, you as an individual or a device as an entity can share multiple roles in this case. So you can be the custodian, the owner, and the administrator all at the same time, and indeed be a user as well. We also categorize our access control in three main ways. Administrative, where we can also refer to them as management controls as well. And these include these things that we've been working towards in terms of our identification, our classification, our marking, our value evaluation, those sorts of things. And they include the policies for access control, the procedures for implementing access control, the definitions around our assets and objects, the classification scheme that we choose to apply, whether it's military or commercial, and the roles and responsibilities. So who are the custodians, the owners, the administrators, and the users? Physical controls focus on protecting the physical boundaries of facilities and employee safety. So we're literally talking about real world physical security. Okay, so we're not talking about firewalls and that sort of thing now. We're not talking about those types of boundaries. We're talking about security guards, closed circuit TVs, SWAT card access to particular doors. We're talking about keys and locks, fences, barbed wire, dogs, guard dogs, all those sorts of things. Fire suppression systems, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. All those sorts of things are physical control. So anything that helps us to protect our assets, whether it's against the environment that they are in or external intruders, be they animal or human based. And then the third one is technical, which everyone loves. No, very few people like physical. Most people don't like administrative because that's the boring stuff, but everyone loves technical. But let me tell you that if you don't have particularly administrative, then your technical controls are not going to work as well as what they should. You must always have good administrative controls, so clearly defined policies, procedures, definitions, classifications, roles, and responsibilities before you can then implement appropriate technical controls. Otherwise, it's just guesswork. Technical controls can also be called logical or digital controls, and they include all the different technical, digital hardware and software tools that we all like to play with daily. So firewalls, IDS, antivirus, anti-malware, access control lists, monitoring systems, alarm systems, you name it. Then within each of those particular control categories, so administrative, physical, or technical, we can further categorize them based on their particular purpose, of which there are 6. So preventative, which enforces some sort of security policy so that incidents or compromisation does not occur, or at least the risk is greatly reduced. We have deterrent type controls, which are similar to preventive, but their purpose is to discourage attacks rather than to actively stop them. So things like warning signs and banners, for example, are a couple of things that you could use to deter. Detective controls are then used to detect, monitor, and respond and investigate to attacks when they occur, as they're occurring and after they've occurred. Corrective controls are used to reduce the impact of an incident or to stop an incident while it's occurring. Recovery controls are aimed at, again, to be used generally while something is happening, but sometimes after it as well. It helps us to get back to our day one status, so our full operational status. And then compensating controls help to provide a complement or alternative to one of these other controls if they're not adequate. Now, classifying a control can sometimes be quite difficult. So for an example, an access list is clearly preventative, but it can also be considered to be deterrent, particularly if people know there are access lists there. So it is preventative, but it can also be deterrent. It could also potentially be corrective as well. So something that we apply while an incident is in play. So there's not always a clear delineation for all of the different controls that we can implement. Sometimes there's a bit of grey. You have to use your best judgment on which categories can be applied to which controls. And honestly, in most cases, when you're in implementation phase, it doesn't really matter, but control phase or categorization, documentation, really important to make sure that you've got at least some sort of categorization happening for each of your controls, both as a broad category and a purpose-based category as well. The Cisco attack continuum that they like to talk about simply shows it in this way here. So before an attack, during attack, and after. So before, we try to use preventive and deterrent controls in order to stop things from happening. During, we use detective and corrective primarily to find out what's going on first and then to fix whatever things are going on, depending on what we've found. And then recovery, generally used after an incident. Not always, but generally used after an incident. And then at any stage, we can use these compensating controls. So perhaps implementing another category of control when one doesn't work. We now move on to our access control models. Now that we've got through our categorization, our classification, our marking, our evaluation, and we understand the different categories of our controls. The access control models are simply conceptual frameworks. That's all they are. So they provide you with a path, if you like, or a framework in which you can design access controls and then implement access controls within the system. Similarly to the OSI model, okay, the OSI model is a framework for manufacturers to apply to the communication sides of their hardware and software to ensure that their products will interact with any other vendor's products. So it's a standard form or standard framework for communications. And it allows all different vendors' equipment to communicate with any other vendor's communicating equipment without any issue. And it's worked perfectly well for many years. Similarly, these are conceptual frameworks for manufacturers of either hardware, software, firmware, middleware, whatever you want to call it, to implement in order to be able to control access to their particular product or the output of their particular product. so files, for example. However, you can also use these as conceptual frameworks yourself as well. So you don't have to rely, or you would never rely strictly on a particular manufacturer doing this. You would also be in charge of this as well. And the main access control models are discretionary access control, mandatory access control, role-based access control, and attribute-based access control, which are referenced in these particular standards. I won't go through this particular decision because we'll look at that as we go through the next few slides. If we compare them though, the discretionary access control is the simplest of the whole lot, and we'll see how in a minute. The problem with it is that the security policy can be bypassed, and there's no centralized concept of control over this particular model. So it's like a peer-to-peer type thing. Mandatory access control has very strict control over the information flow. So it's mandatory. So that's a strong point of it, but it is much more complex to administer and to control. Role-based access control is really scalable and easy to manage, but it has an increase in role definitions. Now, a really good example of this role-based access control is your typical directory services type environment. So Active Directory, for example, where you have users, you put those users into groups, and you provide access to those groups to the resources. That's a perfect example of a role-based access control. We have groups which define roles for users. We put the users into the groups to give them access to that role, and then we give the groups access to the resources that are required for each of those roles. Attribute-based access control is really, really flexible, but it's far more complex compared to discretionary and role-based, and we'll see why in the example slide coming up shortly. So if we look at discretionary access control and the key concepts. So with DAC, authorization is decided by the owner of the object. And in these systems, access permissions are associated with the particular object. And then access is typically enforced using access control lists. So in this case, we have our user Derek, who has applied read access to this particular file. So Derek has access to read. Inside the access control model, we have read is allowed through or read is blocked. And it's as simple as that. It really is just, and this is just for read, but you would have potentially other attributes for write, change, delete as well. So a very simple model. Derek gets what he's told he can have as determined by the owner of that particular object. With mandatory access control, the operating system or policy enforcer decides on whether to grant access. The owner does not have control and cannot decide to grant access to a resource. The security policy is enforced by security label. So how is that different? So here, Derek is the owner of this file. So he has administered the read access on that. So he has access to that. But having said that, he also has full control to change it if he wanted to, because he's the owner. In this case here, it doesn't matter whether Derek has created this file or not. The access control system has rules built in it, which determines who can access that file. And it may be that if that access control has been changed for Derek, that he won't be able to access it. So in this particular case, we've got clearance is secret and a category is engineering. That's the security label that is applied to Derek. So he's got secret and engineering rights. The file is labeled as secret and engineering. So Derek now has access to it. Hannah, on the other hand, has a clearance level of confidential, but is also in the engineering category. Both have to match before access is granted. Because the clearance levels are different, Hannah doesn't have any access to it. Now, however, that sounds all fine and dandy. If, however, an administrator was to go and change the clearance level to top secret, then Derek would also no longer have access to that file, regardless of the fact that he might be the actual owner. The administrator or custodian has changed the access, and so it then blocks the owner from getting access to it. Whereas in discretionary access, the owner has complete access over that particular file and can do as he freely wants to do. In role-based access control, the access decision is based on the role or function that the subject belongs to. In a typical Active Directory type setup, that means what group they are basically in. Now, the role assignment is not discretionary. Users get assigned to a role based on the policies that we implement as an organization. So if, for example, you're an IT worker, you will be put into the IT group, for example. But if you were say we worked in a bank and you were a teller, you wouldn't be put into the IT users group, because organizational policy is not going to allow a regular teller to have access to all the same systems that an IT administrator would need access to. And in this example here, we can see we've got some engineering servers and applications. Derek's an engineer, so he's in the engineering group. So the authentication model will allow him to access those particular servers. However, Hannah, who is in sales, yes, she can access the sales application, but she is not going to be able to access the engineering servers and applications. And we could also assume, although it's not in the diagram, that Derek cannot access the sales applications. Whereas if we had a particular IT administrator, they may actually be able to access that. The last one is attribute-based access control. So with these access controls, the decision is based on the attributes associated with the subjects, the objects, or the environment, and how they interact together. So this is really, really flexible, but it can get really overwhelmingly complex to try and set up and administer. It needs a lot of work, a lot of preparation and understanding of your organization and information flow, and the value of your assets and the objectives of the different workers within your organization in order to be able to comprehensively set this up and deploy it well. So it's very, very flexible, provides great security, but can be difficult and complex to set up. Attributes are simply any characteristics of a user, a resource, or the surrounding environment. And user role, identity, and security classification can be considered attributes. So in this particular example, simple example here, we have an access control which says these following statements. All engineers who work in the security business unit and are assigned to the group Next-Gen Firewall projects are allowed to read and write all the design documents in the Next-Gen Firewall project folder when connecting from building A. So we've got a lot to break down there. We've got a lot of conditions to meet in order to be able to access this particular file. So if we look through the example, we have this person has a role of engineer, so that's good. They're in the business unit security engineering. So they're not in the security business group, but they're in the security engineering group. Their projects are NG Firewall, NG IPS, and VPN Client. So they are a member of NG Firewall projects, so that's okay. They tick that box. They're allowed to read and write all the design documents. Okay, so that then are attributes elsewhere, not of the user in particular, but only when they're connecting from building A. So this particular user is in building A, and they tick the box for the projects, they tick the box for the engineer, but they actually don't tick the box from this here, from the business unit. So it says security business unit. Although I guess, yeah, engineers, it shows them as getting access. If you're really strict about this particular example, it says security business unit, not security engineering. So they could be different business units. But the assumption here is that security business unit includes security engineering. Okay, so that, because I knew there would be questions about this particular diagram. So if we assume that security business unit means security engineering as well, and we see that this file is category engineer, and it's in the project folder NG Firewall, and its environmental and resource attributes allow read and write, then this particular user will be able to access that file and use it as they feel free. Now, if any one of these attributes was to change, so if this business unit was to be, say, become accounting and finance, then they would lose access dynamically to that particular file and that resource. Or if they were taken out of one of these project groups, or they tried to access it from building B, or they changed their role, or the file was removed from this project, or the file had its category reassigned, or the read and write attributes were changed. If one of any of those attributes was to change, then the access control would change accordingly. Okay, so you can see it's really, really flexible, and you can have lots of different attributes, and you can use any or all of those attributes to determine who gets access to your subjects. So you could just say, if you want to keep it simple, you could say all engineers can have read-write access to all the design documents. So you could make it as simple as that. Or you can make it as complex as you like as well, as it is in this particular statement. So very flexible, but particularly as your complexity of the number of attributes that you have grows and the combinations of those attributes grow, so the more attributes you want to use simultaneously, then the more complex it is going to be to administer and to manage. Access control mechanism, simply stated, is any method that we use for implementing one of those access control models that we've just discussed. More commonly, role-based and attribute-based. Now, a system can implement multiple access control mechanisms at the time. In some modern systems, the notion of access control may be considered obsolete because of the complexity of the system and its requirement for more advanced mechanisms. I see there's some questions coming up there. I'll get through the next few slides because we're almost done, and then I'll revisit all of those. Some access control methods, some of the more well-known ones, include access control lists. Now, access control lists are very object-centric, so they're focusing on access to particular objects. And that, depending on the type of access control, if you really strip it down to access control lists in a Cisco implementation, that's not 100% strictly true, because you can base it on the subject as well. But typically, we would say particularly in a not a simple access standard access list, but in a more complex access list, we would be focused on protecting the object itself rather than from where the communication is coming from. A capability table is subject-centric. So that is looking at the capabilities or the operations that a particular subject can perform on our objects. We can have access control matrices, which show an interlocking field, if you like, of capabilities and access control. We have restricted interfaces, where particular operations or particular clients or particular roles may be restricted. And that comes down to literally the physical or logical interface that you might be using or communicating through. And then we have content-dependent access control. So access control is dependent on the content that you're trying to access within a given resource. So, for example, certain database fields within a database, for example. So depending on which content you're trying to access, you may or may not have access to that. And then context-dependent access control is around building a context of the environment you're in, or the environment in which you're trying to access from, or the environment you're trying to access to, including the assets and the information contained within. So that's a little bit like your attribute-based access control as well. In terms of identity and access control implementation, there are literally hundreds and thousands, if not more, ways of doing this. So there's lots of different technologies, protocols, methods that we can use to implement identity, authentication, authorization, accounting, and then the technical controls that we build around them. Some of the more popular ones and the ones that are more salient for the Cisco CyberOPS exam include things like our AAA type services. So those services that will do authentication, authorization, and accounting. And as part of authentication, they also do identity because you need to provide a username, for example, to get in. And a couple of examples of these are the Radius and TACACS protocols. TACACS being primarily a Cisco proprietary, Radius being an open standard. We could use port-based access control. So that is physically limiting the devices that can connect through our network ports, or verifying those particular devices before we allow them to connect to the network. We may use some sort of network access or network admission control as well as part of that. So in other words, we have a device attempting to connect to our network. We first of all interrogate it to ensure that its level of security, it's antivirus, it's anti-malware, it's personal firewall or intrusion detection system, or whatever other policies we want to implement are enforced on that device before we allow it access to the network. Now, if they're not enforced, we would pass them off to a remediation zone or server, which would then update all those particular policies until they were up to scratch, and then we would allow them access to the network. Access control lists and firewalling are a really simple and commonly used way of controlling traffic flow in and out of our network. Identity management and profiling is about our roles and groups and responsibilities and coming up with certain profiles for certain job roles or certain people based on how they need to interact with our data and information. Intrusion detection and prevention is obviously a big one. So literally IDS, IDP, and of course our antivirus and anti-malware. So we sort of go more from authentication down to our preventative type controls or detective type controls. There is lots more. And these are all spoken about more in depth in the CyberOPS certification guide. Now, obviously, each one of these, you could literally do a multi-week course on each one of them. So we're not going to spend a lot of time drilling down on any of these. These are just some examples of the controls that can potentially be used. And with that said, that's the brushstrokes. That's the broad brushstrokes of access control models and authentication identity management. So your learning tasks this week are to obviously watch this recording if you're not watching it live. There's other number of videos and resources up on Moodle site for you, plus the Module 3 Quizlet at the end of the week. All right, so I see there's some questions, so let's go back and have a look at them. All right, so the first one is, let me just turn this pointer off. The first one is related to these classification models. So how do we clearly differentiate between government confidential and commercial confidential? And the answer is that we don't use both models at the same time. We use one or the other. So inside the military model, it is classified as any information that is confidential will cause some sort of damage to our organization should it be compromised. Whereas in a commercial, it creates really, so potentially business ending damage. Okay, so that's the difference. The difference is the level within confidential within commercial is going to provide a much higher level of damage compared to military government classification. Now, what that level of damage is and what that sort of damage is going to be dependent on your individual organization, the information it handles, the way it's presented to the public, if you like, or the users or subjects that access that. But the simple answer is confidential in a commercial sense creates much more damage than in that military government classification. So you don't use both classification schemes at once and you don't mix and match them. You choose to use either one or the other. Now, as a commercial organization, you could choose to use the military government one as well, but just keep in mind that you would not then be in step with most of the other commercial organisations that have have any method of classification and marking. Some organisations don't even bother to do it. So it's you've got to go with what you think you need. But typically anything outside military or government will use that commercial classification. So the next question. So in RBAC, so role-based access control, a role is an object. No, a role is a job. So it's literally a job role or a function that needs access to an object. So for example, if there was a database server, you might have two roles in your organization. One might be as a database user, and the other one is a non-database user, just to keep it really simple. Okay, so they're the two roles that you've got. So the role is you're either a database user or you're not a database user. Now, if you're a database user, you then get access. If your user account is in the database user role or group, then you get access to the database server. If your user is not in that particular group or role, or it's in the non-database user group or role, so either one of those conditions, so it just has to not be in the database user role or a group, then you won't get access to that object. So a role is basically a definition of some sort of duty or role or set of procedures or set of duties that you would perform in a job. So think of it as a job function or a job role. And that job function or job role, if you're assigned to that job role or job function, then you will have access to the objects or services or servers that you need in order to perform the functions of your job role. So what are the differences between mandatory access and attribute access control? They seem the same, although ABAC uses more logic. I also believe ABAC is also called role-based access control, right? No. So role-based access control is literally where we have users in groups, which are then given access to particular objects. So it's quite simple. Access-based access control uses a lot more attributes, okay? So they're not just necessarily groups, they are attributes which are specific to particular users. In this example, they you could consider them to be groups, so a more complex implementation of role-based access control, but it's not the same thing. Some of these attributes, because you could literally use something like fingerprint or eye color or hair color or a combination of those three to uniquely identify an individual person. And if we said something like fingerprint as an attribute, then that's going to be unique to that particular person. So in that case, it's not part of a group or a role, if that makes sense. It's also not, and so that's why it's more complex, more granular, more fine-tuned than role-based access control. There are components of it which are similar, but in this simple example, we're not looking at some of the more in-depth attributes like fingerprint or environmental attributes around the particular environment in which the files may live in. So it might be a data center, it might be a particular cabinet, a shelf rack, a particular server, a particular drive on the server. All of those are specific attributes as well. Can a document be unclassified yet not public? Well, if we look at these particular models, that doesn't fit. Unclassified is in the military government classification, public is in the commercial classification. So if it's unclassified, it literally means that anyone can access it. We're not worried about it. But it could be that it's not been made public. That doesn't mean that it can't be gotten, it can't be accessed by some sort of member of the public. So we've got to remember these are quite strict definitions. Okay, so yes, something might be unclassified in the military classification or public in the commercial classification and not actually be made public. So it doesn't literally mean that if you've got it classified as unclassified or public, that you would then just make it freely available. It just means that if it was received or transmitted outside our organisation, we're not going to worry about it. So it can be disseminated to the public or it's unclassified, but that doesn't mean that it actually is made public overtly. Okay, we'll leave the questions. Okay. We've done that one. Okay, let's answer this one. Is there accounting before a specific resource is accessed? E.g., how many attempts have been made by a subject to access the object before being revoked? That is part of accounting as well. So yes, if you try to access a file or system or device that you haven't been authorized to access, then yes, that will also log. Well, it can be set to log. Whether it is or not depends on your configuration of your system, but yes, it can be, and I would say should be logged. So Rod said, would Cisco Identity Services engine with profiling be an example of ABAC? Yeah, it fits into that category. You could think of it as in that category. Yep. Does every institution need to conduct a regular system audit to ensure that other unauthorized users to restricted levels of system category are limited? That would make sense to do that. They don't have to, although in some fields you would need to do that. That would be mandated by legislation or other regulatory requirements. And it is certainly a good idea. It would make sense to do that if you were serious about security, but you certainly don't have to do that in all organizations. But it would be a very wise choice. So when government deals with private industry, this labeling is changed sometimes not. And not, particularly in Australia, not all government organisations will typically use top secret. That's more towards the military side of it in many governments. And in that case, if they're going to use top secret and secret, then that certainly wouldn't be disseminated or confidential. It's only the unclassified that would be released, and unclassified would stay as unclassified. If a government department had a heavy interaction with a commercial organisation, then they would typically use the commercial classification exclusively. Not always, but typically. And I'll say that with the caveat, in my experience. That's not to say that there are other organisations or government organisations that I haven't worked with, because I haven't worked with them all, obviously, that might do something different, but that would be the norm rather than the opposite. So Rod said, confidential, private, sensitive, public. Are these commercial classifications of terms defined in any standards, industry handbooks, or anything like that? Yes, well, they are. Where they originally come from, I don't know. I couldn't answer that off the top of my head, but they are certainly widely used and widely understood to be based on these particular definitions. But where they originally came from, that's a really good question. I don't know that. I'd be interested to find that out and update you with that next week. Okay, so ABAC, same as rule-based. Okay, not really. So rule-based access control is not one of the roles we're going to talk about, but rule-based access control is really more closely related to role-based access control, but it's used in situations around confederated identity management where you are using and I'll give you an example in a minute, where logins are used to access systems that are outside your administrative control. So role-based access control would typically be under the control of a single organization. Rule-based access control is when you would use those same authentication details to access other systems outside your control. So a perfect example of that is a Google account. Right, so if you have a Google account, which pretty much everyone does, you might sign up to a particular subscription service using that Google account. Now, that subscription service will allow Google to actually authenticate you via the Google authentication service. And then once you've been authenticated, you would get a time-based cookie on your device. And that cookie would signal to your subscription service that I've been authenticated, I am who I say I am, can you give access to the system? And then the subscription-based service would say, okay, we trust that the cookie is genuine and that you have been authenticated. And based on this user account, I'm going to give you these rights, which have been determined by the level of subscription that you paid for. So if you pay for a gold membership, you get full access, silver membership, not quite so much access, bronze membership, even less access. But the actual authentication process is done by Google, and whatever rights you have on the Google system are not transported to the subscription service. That subscription service will dynamically apply its own access control based on the authentication cookie that's been provided by Google. So that's how role and rule-based differ. You're still, when you get into the subscription service, your user account or your authenticated identity is still placed into a group, which gives you access to the system, so say gold, silver, or bronze group, but the authentication process is handled by another entity. Is it generally the case that ABAC is better than RBAC? Not necessarily. So it depends on the system, depends on the implementation and what your requirements are. Role-based access control and attribute-based access control are the two most real-world examples, because we see these implemented all the time in typical Active Directory type systems, directory systems, or in our typical authentication systems that allow us access to our business applications and our work environment. Mandatory access and discretionary access are more old-fashioned, so they're precursors, if you like, before the days of the internet and we had access to everything and everyone needed access to everything. When the world was much more simple, mandatory access control and discretionary access control were the norm. Discretionary access control can still be thought of like as in peer-to-peer. So if you have a peer-to-peer network with some friends with just using your laptop, you're not connected to the internet or any other network, you're just doing file sharing over Bluetooth or something, that could be considered discretionary access control. Or if you tightly control the controls around your files that you're sharing, then it could be mandatory access control. So it's a really simple way of implementing access control, not typically used in commercial grade systems, not the ones that we're talking about in terms of business access, maybe in robotics or automation systems or construction systems, manufacturing systems, perhaps, but certainly not in your typical run-of-the-mill system. Is there any sort of intersection between attribute-based and role-based access controls? Okay, I think I've already answered that one with the previous discussions. In a corporate environment, what are the downsides to allowing users to use their corporate account to authenticate to external services? It would depend on what your requirements are and what they share across that corporate account. But obviously, anytime you use a different system to authenticate compared to the one that is authorizing, then there is a potential for problems to occur. Okay, last couple of questions, or Neil sent through a link, so thank you for that. Neil, I'll have a look at that and post that up on the Moodle if that's appropriate. And then last one, I think we've gone nearly half an hour over, so we need to 15 minutes over. What I'm saying, my clock that clock seems to be fast. Anyway, we're a bit over time, so I might just say this will be the last question. So I'm pretty sure the commercial classification of information pre-cyber days came from AS 9001 and the internet and the ISO, International Standard for Quality. Okay, thanks, Mel. Good. So there you go. There's the answer to that discussion we we're having before about commercial classification. So Mel said, pretty sure it came from AS 9001. So thanks for that. Might follow that up and confirm that. But that's given me a good starting point to have a look at. So thank you very much. Okay, so with that all said, that's all we need to get through for this evening. So next week, we're going to be looking at some typical types of attacks and the vulnerabilities that facilitate the ability to launch those sorts of attacks. Now, it won't be exhaustive. Obviously, in an hour or so that we've got to discuss these sorts of things, it would be impossible to go through everything, but we'll have a look at some of the more common sorts of attacks as mentioned in the CyberOPS certification guide, and we'll look at some of the vulnerabilities related to those attacks and potentially talk about some of the mitigation techniques or common ways in which we would help protect ourselves against those sorts of attacks. Also remember that at the end of next week, we have, there's 2 quizzes that will open next week. One is the quiz for Module 4, so that will open at the end of next week. Module 4 will be available come Monday, or is it Friday night? One or the other, I can't remember, but it'll be at the end of this week. Module 4 will become active to you. There will be a quiz at the end of Module 4, which will just deal with Module 4, and then the final exam quiz will collate questions from all of the 4 weeks of content into the final exam. And that's the one that you need to pass in order to be able to get your tick off for the certificate for being enrolled in this particular course. Now, you must at least have 1 passing attempt, so that is 3 out of 5, for each of the 4 module quizzes before you are eligible to sit that final quiz. And just lastly, I note there was some queries about some of the questions in the module quiz, the recent module quiz. One of them was perfectly valid, so I've changed the answer to that. The answer was incorrect. That was around the responsibilities of the service as software as a service, infrastructure as a service. So that one's been remediated. The other ones were okay. So there was a couple of queries about all of the above type questions. I've now changed that so that those questions won't, those answers won't randomize. So all of the above will always appear at the bottom. But you can assume if you haven't seen it before and you get it, then just understand that all of the above means all of the other answers as well. I think that's pretty straightforward. So with all that said, thank you for your attendance tonight. I might just quickly hand back to Jack for any potential finish up words she would like to say.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thanks everybody for attending today. We look forward to having you back next week for Module 4. In the meantime, we would love it if everybody could fill out the survey on your experience doing this short course. It really helps us to improve the way that we deliver all of our short courses in a variety of different topics, which you can check out at the learn.itmasters.edu.au page as well if you're interested. As well as that, as I mentioned earlier, the exam, as Matt just mentioned, will be available at the end of next week after Module 4 has been delivered. It will take roughly 1 week after that for results and certificates to start becoming available. And you do need to complete all of the prior week's quizzes in order to have access to the exam. This short course, like all of our short courses based on our university level subjects, is eligible for you to claim 1 subject worth of course credit towards any full-length IT Masters CSU course, grad cert or masters, if you complete 3 of our short courses successfully. So you can get in touch with our eligibility team that Lily has very helpfully just dropped the link in the chat too as well if you're interested in that. And other than that, if you've got any questions for Matt or other participants, drop those in the forums. If you have any administrative questions, please get in touch with our short courses team. That's shortcourses@itmasters.edu.au. And in the meantime, thanks very much once again for attending. Hope you all enjoyed the content. I thought it was very informative and very engaging. And we will see you here next week, same time, same place. That is 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, or your local equivalent, next week on Thursday. So thanks very much, everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, depending on where in the world you are. Thanks, team. Bye-bye.